This is the second part of a two-part series about how to produce Dolby Atmos with Pro Tools. Last week I talked about how to use the internal Dolby Atmos renderer in Pro Tools, and in today's video we will use the external Dolby Atmos renderer for this purpose. If you haven't seen the first part of this two-part series, I recommend checking it out. I'll leave a link in the description below. However, it's not necessary to watch that video in order to understand what we'll be doing today. Everything in this video is self-contained. So let's roll the intro. Before I start, I need to address two common questions about the external Dolby Atmos renderer. The first question that I often get is, can you use the external renderer in Windows? And the answer to that is no. Even though there's a Windows version of the renderer, it can't be used in a production workflow with a digital audio workstation. Unfortunately, that's not possible. So what we're going to do today requires a Mac. It does not work on Windows. If you're a Windows user and want to produce Dolby Atmos content with Pro Tools, you need to use the internal Dolby Atmos workflow, which I demonstrated in last week's video. The second question that I often get is, why would you use the external renderer given that Pro Tools now offers an internal workflow? And this is indeed a very good question. Now, the internal renderer included with Pro Tools offers almost everything that the external renderer does. However, there are a few exceptions that are primarily of interest to professional studios and users. First, the external renderer has built-in room correction features that allow you to fine-tune your speaker setup to your room acoustics, and this is important for studios. Second, it has the option to create quality control deliverables in MP4 format. These are encoded with Dolby Digital Plus with joint object coding, or DD plus JOC, and allow you to test your Atmos content with various audio equipment. That's also really important for professionals. And third, there are a few additional speaker layouts supported by the external renderer that are not in the internal one. Now, these are the reasons why you might prefer the external renderer over the internal one, so it makes sense to look at how that works. So with that being said, let's jump into Pro Tools. Now, if you have seen my last week's video, I'm going to do pretty much the same thing in this video as well, just with the external Dolby Atmos renderer instead of with the internal Dolby Atmos renderer. And I'm actually going to do that in two different ways, because you can use the external Dolby Atmos renderer with Pro Tools in two different ways. You can either use them in the traditional way, where you send the audio from Pro Tools into the Dolby Atmos renderer and then from the Dolby Atmos renderer into your reproduction system, or you can also use the new way, which takes advantage of a new feature in Pro Tools, which is the auxiliary input-output that allows you to use the Dolby Atmos renderer almost like an output board gear that allows you to send the audio into the renderer and then from the renderer back into Pro Tools, and then essentially work with the audio in Pro Tools as usual. Now, what I'm going to use is a very simple session that consists of two loops. These two loops come from a sample developer that I like a lot. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. And they're really only here to demonstrate how everything works. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply start with a very straightforward stereo session again, and let's call that test. And let's start with the input-output settings as stereo, and let's create. So once again, you can use one of the templates, obviously, but I'm just going to show you how that works if you just start out with a regular stereo session. Let's press create. Now, a couple of things that we need to make sure, and the first thing is that we need to make sure that we have the object visible here. So if you don't see that object tab here, right-click on that and make sure that this is selected, because we will need that later when we are moving objects around. The second thing is that for the playback engine, what we need is the Dolby Audio Bridge. This Dolby Audio Bridge is essentially a 130-channel audio device that is there just to send the audio from Pro Tools into the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, the second thing that we need to do is we need to complete that audio signal chain by opening up the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's just open up the Dolby Atmos renderer here. And here we have the Dolby Atmos renderer. And in the renderer, the same thing, in the preferences, we need to make sure that the input is now the Dolby Audio Bridge. This is where the audio comes in from Pro Tools, and the output device is whatever device you are using. In my particular case, it's the Rodecaster, so that you guys hear what I'm doing here. And we take note of the LTC input channel because we're actually going to use that or need that later. That is a 129. And then essentially the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drop these two loops into my session. And the first one is this is the drum loop. This is going to become my bed. And then the second one is a plug loop that is going to become an object. That's really all I need in order to demonstrate what is going on. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to complete the input-output setup in Pro Tools. So let's go into this setup input-output section. And the first thing that we need to do is in Dolby Atmos, in the Dolby Atmos tab, let's select the external Dolby Atmos renderer. We need to select the renderer host. In my case, this is the same machine that Pro Tools is running on. If you don't see that here, you can click on this little triangle and that should give you the options that you have. And then simply we need to enable that. And as soon as we enable that, it will kind of check if there is an external Dolby Atmos renderer on those machines. And if there is, it gives you the green light. That essentially means the connection has been established. And then we need to pull the configuration of the Dolby Atmos renderer. So by clicking on this button here, pull configuration, it will essentially kind of check with the Dolby Atmos renderer what configuration it has, and it will pull that in. And so if we put that here, we have the configuration going on. And then let's just double check the output. Now in the output, we now see we have the bed here. This is not enabled because we have outputs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6. So let's just delete those and enable that. And that's everything that we need to do in the output. Just make sure that everything is mirrored correctly. And then the one thing that I would recommend is that you also check that you have the output 129 and 130. Because depending on how you set that up, that will actually be there or not. If you don't see that output active, you need to kind of add that output as well, because we are going to need the output 129 in order to send our LTC signal. So the final thing that we now need to do is we need to simply send our tracks into the corresponding outputs. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send the drums into the bed. And then I'm going to send the plugs into the object 11, 12. And I'm going to once again select no output here just to be sure. Otherwise, I'm going to have everything twice. And I'm going to simply say object here, and that will make sure that that essentially kind of this is also an object. And if we play now, we should hear the audio already. And it's now going through the external Dolby Atmos renderer. I'm rendering currently in stereo because that's all I have in this setup. And the bed is essentially the drum loop. So if we solo the drum loop, essentially see the first two channels. Currently, I'm not doing any panning whatsoever. Now, the one thing that I'm going to notice is that we currently don't see any time code. We don't see any time signal. And the reason for that is because if you're working with the external Dolby Atmos renderer, you actually need to make sure that the time code is sent manually. So this is not done something that Pro Tools does automatically. This is something that you need to do manually. Fortunately, that is very, very straightforward to do. All we really need to do is we need to add a mono track. So let's open up that and let's add a mono track. It's going to be an audio track, and let's call that LTC. And let's create that. And we are going to send that to output number 129. And this is why it was really important that you have the output 129 in the output section. So once again, if you don't see that here, you need to create that additional output and kind of map it to 129. And then we're going to put the LTC plugin on that track. So let me just open up the mix window. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the LTC plugin. It's under other here. And going to use that LTC generator, and that should take care of everything. So let's close that again and let's play. Unsolo that. And if I go now into the renderer, I obviously need to click the kind of the button here, and then essentially I will get the timecode information correctly. Okay, so let's move the objects a little. And I'm not going to talk too much about the Penna. The Penna in Pro Tools is fairly sophisticated. I've done that in my previous video. If you want to know exactly how the Penna works, I invite you to watch that video. But essentially what you need to do is you need to click on this little thingy here, and that will open up the Penna, and now you can select where the audio is going. So let's maybe kind of move that a little bit to the kind of a little bit back, just so that we get some additional, a little bit upwards, and maybe increase the size a bit, and then put some LFE in there. And that should now essentially, yeah, pretty much everything, but two of the head channels, kind of the rear channels are not there yet. Okay, so let's also move the object a little. So once again, we open up the Penna here. Let's do the same thing. Let's move that back to the side, up. And let's maybe also increase the size. And then we essentially see the objects here, and everything is sent into the external Dolby Atmos renderer. So now that we've created our Dolby Atmos session, how do we export that? And that is very straightforward to do, just like bouncing anything else. We go into the file section and we say bounce mix, and in bounce mix essentially we get this dialog that asks us what exactly do we want to bounce, what do we want to bounce the master file, do we want to bounce re-renders. And if you're working with the Dolby Atmos renderer, you know you can kind of create re-renders and work with re-renders, which is a really convenient way of working with the Dolby Atmos renderer. I'm not going to cover that in this particular video. If you want me to talk about re-renders with the external Dolby Atmos renderer, let me know. I can certainly do a video about that, but here I'm not going to cover that. So we're going to leave everything alone and simply going to say bounce, and that will essentially bounce everything. And if I now go into the where I have that bounced, essentially I now see this test here, file here, and that is our Dolby Atmos master file. If you open that up in the Dolby Atmos renderer, you will see that this is a perfectly fine Dolby Atmos master file. So this is actually really, really convenient to do. And one of the good things about Pro Tools is that you can also load that back in. So for example, if you get a master file from somebody else, you can simply import that into Pro Tools and then essentially start with a Dolby Atmos session created from an imported Dolby Atmos master file, which is really cool as well. If you want to kind of see how that works, I once again invite you to watch my previous video where I actually showed how to import a Dolby Atmos master file into Pro Tools, and here obviously it's exactly the same thing. So this is the traditional way of working with the external Dolby Atmos renderer, but there is actually a second way how we can actually use the Dolby Atmos renderer, and that is with the auxiliary input-output, and that allows you to use your regular audio interface within Pro Tools and use a secondary interface that kind of communicates with the Dolby Atmos renderer. So essentially the Dolby Atmos renderer functions like an external output board gear, if you like. And that's actually really inconvenient to set up as well. So let me just kind of go back into Pro Tools. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new session, and let's call that test 2. And I'm going to start in exactly the same way by creating this stereo session. Yeah, let's save that. And let's open that up. Now, when you're working with the auxiliary input-output, the first thing that you want to do is you want to change the playback engine to whatever your audio interface is. So in my particular case, I'm going to set that back to the Rodecaster. And that will essentially close Pro Tools and reopen it. It's going to come up with all kinds of things because we did a couple of things to the Pro Tools session that it doesn't know what to do with. But we're going to fix everything. So I'm now back to having everything set up in a way that essentially works for stereo projects. Let me just check the input-output here. So I have the output is just left-right. I have a couple of buses here. I don't really need those. I'm going to come back to them in a second. So let me just kind of delete everything and maybe kind of set that back to default. And Dolby Atmos, I'm going to disable that for a second. And I think that is everything that I needed to do. So let's once again bring our two loops into our session. So I have this drum loop here. So I'm going to drop that in here. And then I'm going to have the plug loop. Same thing here. Now, for some reason, it brought it in as, whoops, where did it go? Here we go. And for some reason, it kind of sends it into bus 1, but I actually want that into the output for a moment. So I'm going to send the two outputs left and right, and that should already kind of make it sure that I can hear the audio. So let's just play the audio. So everything works the way it's supposed to work. Okay, so let's set up our external Dolby Atmos renderer as a device that we are going to control with the auxiliary input-output. And for that purpose, what we need to do is we need to go into the setup settings under input-output. And here, essentially, we have the auxiliary input-output. So we click on that. And what we need to do now is we need to tell Pro Tools what's the input-output device, this auxiliary input-output device. Now, for the output device, we need to use the Dolby Audio Bridge. So we're going to select that as the output device. But we also need to bring the audio back into Pro Tools. So we also need an input device. And for the input device, Pro Tools comes with what they call a Pro Tools bridge, and there are a couple of different options that you have. I'm simply going to use the largest one, which has 64 channels here. Going to select that and simply going to say OK. And then essentially I'm going to go into the Dolby Atmos settings, going to create the external Dolby Atmos renderer, pull the configuration, and that should essentially kind of already do everything it is supposed to do. So it's going to essentially kind of set everything up correctly. And then let's simply kind of test everything. The final thing that I need to do is in the Dolby Atmos renderer, because currently I'm not really sending that back to Pro Tools. What I need to do is I need to go into the preferences. And in the preferences, I need to select the Pro Tools Audio Bridge here, and I'm simply going to say accept. That now makes sure that the audio comes into the Dolby Atmos renderer in the 130 channels, and then essentially sent back via the Pro Tools bridge. Since I'm using the Pro Tools bridge, let's switch that over to 7.1.4, because this is actually not really sent into my physical output. That is just sent back to Pro Tools. So I now need to bring that back into Pro Tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply add a new track, and this track is going to be a 7.1.4 track. And we're going to make that an auxiliary input track, and let's create that. Now, if I now select an input, I don't really have any options, and the reason for that is because I currently don't have a 7.1.4 input. So what I need to do is I need to go into the input-output settings, and under input, I essentially need to select what channels are going to be my 7.1.4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply delete these, or kind of let's do it the following way. Let's delete these, and let's make that one here a 7.1.4 track, and that will essentially kind of select it here, and I press OK, and I now should be able to kind of select that input. And I have the Pro Tools Audio Bridge here, and everything should work fine. So let's just see if the signal chain works and if I'm actually getting audio. But there are a couple of things that I need to do in order to make that actually work. First of all, I need to send the audio from my two tracks into the Dolby Atmos renderer, and I'm going to do that in exactly the same way I did last week. I'm going to, in my previous example, I'm going to send the drums into the bed, and then essentially I'm going to create an object for the plugs. I just need to make sure that I'm not sending that twice, so I'm going to switch that to no output here. And then obviously I also need to kind of select an output for the auxiliary channel that essentially takes in the 7.1.4, and I'm going to kind of send that to my regular output. And okay, and that should be everything. So let's see. And as you can see, it's now sent into the Dolby Atmos renderer, kind of rendered in 7.1.4, sent back into the Pro Tools session, and here kind of I can process that. Now, the one thing that's still missing, obviously, is once again the LTC channel. So let's just add that quickly. So we're going to add one mono track here, and we're going to send that to output number. And I don't really have that output, so I need to create that. So let's just do one thing here. First of all, let me just add the LTC plugin and going to add the generator here. And let's give that the LTC name. Okay. And then I need to go into the input-output settings. And in the input-output settings under output, I need to add, because I don't think I have one, no, it ends at 128. So I need to create a new path here. Going to do a mono path. Let's call that LTC. Going to create that here. And then I just need to select it here. It has selected automatically 129, so that should work. So let's press OK, and let's then essentially in the output select here this output channel, and that should now do everything that I need to do. So let's play the audio again. And I now have the timecode information here, and everything works correctly. Now there's one additional thing that I just wanted to mention briefly, and that is that you can also bring in re-renders back into Pro Tools. And the way to do that is by simply going into the Dolby Atmos renderer settings under input-output re-renders. You can here select the type of re-renders that you want. Now I've essentially added one 5.1 re-render, and 5.1 re-renders are usually used for loudness measurements, so you can do that. The one thing that you need to do here is that by default, first of all, you need to map the re-renders to the output channels. Now, by default, that starts at channel number 65, so you cannot select anything below 65. The problem is that the Pro Tools Audio Bridge only has 64 channels, so we can't really use 65. So in order to be able to use that, you first need to change the minimum number of channel that you can use for re-renders, and this is done in the room setup. So let's go into room setup here. In the third button here, you can essentially select where the re-render channels are. Once again, by default, this is 64, which is not 65. Sorry, this is not useful for us because we only have 64 channels, so we need to make that smaller. I chose 56, whatever is convenient for you. And once you've done that, you can go back into the re-render section and then essentially select this as the output. And the only thing that you would need to do is you would need to create an input path for that particular input, and then essentially bring that back into Pro Tools. And that works actually really, really, really well. And that's all I wanted to cover today. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join our Discord server for a chat. You'll find an invite link in the description. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.